Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final installment of our Gaza lecture series, co-sponsored by the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, the Al Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, and our African Studies program here at Georgetown University. My name is Nader Hashemi. I teach Middle East politics here at the School of Foreign Service. And I'd like to begin, as we usually do, by having my colleague Coco read out our statement on freedom of expression. This is a requirement before we can begin any event. Coco?
Thank you for coming to this session. Georgetown University is committed to standards promoting speech and expression that foster the maximum exchange of ideas and opinions. While it is recognized that audience members may not share the same views as the speaker, it is expected that everyone in attendance at this event will respect the right of the speaker and the organizing group to share their perspectives and ideas and not cause any disruption to the event's activities. At the end of the event, there will be a question and answer session during which you may ask questions. Please be sure to phrase your comments in the form of a question. In the interest of time, we ask that each person be concise and ask only one question.
Thank you, Coco. So I want to begin by saluting the beautiful idealism, the self-sacrifice, and the courage of students across this country who have set up solidarity camps in support of the people of Gaza. I think what they're seeking to accomplish overlaps with the goals of our lecture series in terms of promoting critically engaged education that seeks to transform the world that we inhabit and also change the direction of American Middle East policy. So if you haven't already, please visit the Gaza encampment that Georgetown is in solidarity with at the George Washington University Yard on H Street between 20th and 21st. Georgetown University is well represented there on a number of levels, so please check that out. So it's a great honor and it's a privilege to host and introduce Ussama Makdisi this afternoon. His presence here and the topic of his lecture could not be more relevant and timely to the world that we inhabit. Please know that tonight at 6 p.m., Ussama and I will be at Busboys and Poets at 450 K Street, having a conversation about events related to Gaza. So you're welcome to join us there as well. In terms of his formal title, Ussama Makdisi is Professor of History and Chancellor's Chair at the University of California, Berkeley. He was previously Professor of History and the first holder of the Arab American Educational Foundation Chair of Arab Studies at Rice University in Houston. He's the author of several outstanding and important books, such as Age of Coexistence, The Ecumenical Frame and the Making of the Modern Arab World, Faith Misplaced, The Broken Promises of U.S.-Arab Relations, 1820 to 2001, and Artillery of Heaven, American Missionaries and the Failed Conversion of the Middle East, which was the winner of the 2008 Albert Hourani Book Award from the Middle East Studies Association, also the winner of the 2009 John Hope Franklin Prize of the American Studies Association, and co-winner of the 2009 British Kuwait Friendship Society Book Prize, given by the British Society of Middle Eastern Studies. Since October the 7th, Ussama Makdisi's Twitter feed has been on fire. I encourage you to check it out. He's also started a new podcast called the Makdisi Street Podcast with his brothers Kareem and Sari. I urge you to also follow that podcast as well. The topic for today's lecture is Palestine, Palestinians, Denialism, and the question of genocide. Please join me in welcoming Ussama Makdisi to Georgetown.
Thank you very much, Professor Hashemi, Nader. Can you hear me in the back? Yep. Okay, I'd like to thank, of course, Georgetown for hosting me, the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, the Al Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, African Studies. Is it center or department? Program in African Studies. Nader, of course, Dr. Fidat Adli, Dr. Lara Smith. Thank you very much, of course, as well to the staff and to each and every one of you for coming out here lunchtime to Georgetown. And I'm especially grateful that my brother, I don't know where he is, he's somewhere in this audience, is here too, because he gave a lecture here yesterday, 2 lectures here yesterday. So it's a great sort of honor for me to be here. I hope I don't embarrass my brother. And I hope I don't embarrass Judith Tucker, who I also need to acknowledge as like the leader in our field, as a great historian and an inspiration to many of us. I'd also like to acknowledge, as Nader did, the extraordinary work of the students both here at Georgetown and at Berkeley, at so many different other campuses, Columbia, Vanderbilt, University of Austin, and University of Texas at Austin, so many different places, the students who have camped out, who have spoken out, students of all faiths who have taken this extraordinary stand against genocide and frankly against silence at a time when so many of our institutions have said absolutely nothing about the destruction of every university in Gaza and the scholasticide that has taken place in the midst of a genocide. And I'll come back to the meaning and the significance of this denial in a moment, towards later on in the talk. But I'd like, at the beginning of this talk, I'd like to take us back to the twilight of the Ottoman era, when what is today Palestine and Israel and Lebanon and Syria, this whole region was part, of course, of the Ottoman Empire. And I'd like to take specifically back to this figure, Khalil al-Sakakini, who in 1908 opened a famous school called the Constitutional School in Jerusalem, which of course was named after the Ottoman Constitution and was meant to be and was in fact one of the first, not the first, but one of the first ecumenical schools, modern ecumenical schools in Palestine and in the Arab East. And the point of the school, opened by Sakakini, was that it was open to students of all faiths. It was a school that Sakakini imagined in the twilight of the Ottoman Empire, which of course he didn't know was going to end within a decade, but was a school that was meant to sort of inspire students, a new generation of students in new methods of teaching. For example, not boring students with boring lectures, but inspiring students, not caning students and beating students when they didn't get the right answer, but again, sort of inspiring them to be critical thinkers. Sakakini was at this time courting his future wife, Sultana Abdu, and he was desperate to sort of convince her that he was worthy of her hand. And the point of all this story, and there's an extraordinary set of essays written by Salim Tamari about Sakakini, on whom I'm drawing today. And the point of these essays and the work of Sakakini is that he and Sultana Abdu and all these other people in late Ottoman Palestine, as well as late Ottoman, what we today call Lebanon and Syria and the Mashriq in general, were sort of, in a sense, aware of the fact that they were living in a time of change, but they believed firmly that it was in their ability to change this world for the better. They believed in their own agency, hence the idea of opening a school. They did not think that they were living at the end of Palestine. They had no understanding of the end of Palestine was coming. They certainly weren't waiting for colonialism to unfold. They were sort of people like any other people, in this case, an educated person, trying to, again, sort of court his wife, writing love letters. Eventually, he ends up going to America. Actually, he was there a year before, in 1907, working in, I think, a paper mill in Vermont, if I'm not mistaken, where he was trying to, like many immigrants, trying to make enough money to convince Sultana Abdu that he was, again, worthy of her hand. So again, Palestinian men like Sakakini and women like Sultana Abdu lived, loved, quarreled, argued, pleaded like any other people. It's such a basic, almost banal point, but it's worth underscoring, because this was a region that was multi-ethnic, multi-religious. There were, of course, Muslims. There were Christians like Sakakini. There were Eastern or Sephardic or Arab Jews, and there were many other peoples besides in this region, all of whom, of course, were part and parcel of this Ottoman Empire. My great-grandfather, in fact, was one of the converts to Protestantism from Greek Orthodox Christianity. He ended up going to, of all things, he ended up in Waco, Texas, where he became a Baptist, apparently. And then he returned to Palestine and opened the first Baptist church in Palestine, in Nazareth, from where he originally came from, Safad. He ended up opening a church a Baptist church in Nazareth. And when he returned to Palestine, so he and Sakakini both, in a sense, were men who traveled, who had this ability to think about the future and try to shape the future according to their own visions. They lived out their lives, and this is the most important point, I suppose. They lived out their lives in what was an interconnected Mashriq that for centuries had linked cities and places and towns like Damascus, Sidon, Akka, Haifa, Beirut, Tripoli, Aleppo, Bethlehem, Jaffa, Nablus, and all their hinterlands together. Like every other Palestinian man and woman, there was no need for either Khalil Sakakini or my great-grandfather or Sultan Abdu to explain the obviousness of their humanity or the naturalness of their attachment to their own land. And the last thing I'll say by way of introduction is think about the names in the Middle East, in the Arab East in particular. My name, my last name, Makdisi of Jerusalem. And that's, of course, after my father's family, which is from Lebanon, because somebody in our family at one point went on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. My sister-in-law is Dimashqi from Damascus, but she's Lebanese. And my other sister-in-law is Beiruti of Beirut, but her family's from Jaffa in Palestine. So again, these names themselves give you a hint about how this world was interconnected. At the same time as Sakakini and my great-grandfather and men and women in the Ottoman East were living out their lives in what we today retrospectively call the Nahda, or the age of the Renaissance, a Jewish Zionist writer and journalist in Vienna by the name of Theodor Herzl was writing and published his famous pamphlet called The Jewish State in 1896. Herzl, unlike Sakakini, had an extraordinarily difficult task. Unlike Sakakini, Herzl was not from Palestine. In fact, Herzl had not been to Palestine when he wrote this pamphlet called The Jewish State. Unlike Sakakini, Herzl knew no Middle Eastern language, but he sought to convince his German language readers, Jews in Europe, and more broadly, Christian Europeans, especially Christian European statesmen whose support for a Jewish state he coveted, why a Jewish national state established in faraway Palestine, or even more distant Argentina, had to be done to combat European anti-Semitism. Herzl insisted that such a modern state would constitute what he called, as you can see from the quotation up there, a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization, as opposed to barbarism. This was his idea of the significance of a Jewish state in Palestine vis-a-vis Europe. The most remarkable aspect of Herzl's writing, from our vantage point today, is how utterly unconcerned he was with the natives of Palestine, such as Sakakini or my great-grandfather, whose land he and the Zionist movement he would come to be identified with sought to acquire to build their fantasy of an exclusively Jewish state in what had always been, and what remains until now, a multi-religious land. Herzl knew, of course, that there were native bodies in Palestine. He also knew that these bodies constituted a problem for his fantasy of building a Jewish state. But the point is, Herzl did not see the Palestinians as a people with significant history or humanity worth seriously considering when contemplating the creation of an exclusive Jewish state. What I'm saying, in other words, is not original. In 1979, in his book, The Question of Palestine, Edward Said, who I'm sure has lectured in this hall probably many times, raised exactly these points. Said described how European Orientalism and obfuscation was key to legitimating colonial Zionism in the Western imagination, and thus colonial Zionism on the ground in Palestine. Yet here we are today, 76 years after the Nakba, at another obviously pivotal and extraordinarily dark moment. The erasure of Palestinian humanity and history has taken on, of course, as we all can see today from Gaza, genocidal proportions. The perverse irony is that in the 5 decades since Said published his book, the state of Israel has steadily and methodically scraped off the liberal veneer of the brutal reality of what an ethno-religious nationalist state means for its non-Jewish, that is to say, Palestinian subjects and citizens. Long before October 7th, in fact, Israelis as a whole have overwhelmingly accepted, Jewish Israelis have overwhelmingly accepted, participated in, condoned, and enforced a system of apartheid across all of historic Palestine. And the reality has been crystal clear for anyone who's had eyes to see, ears to hear, and a heart to feel, long before October 7th. The shocking pogroms in the West Bank from the year before and this past year. Segregation in towns like Al-Khalil and Hebron. Systematic discrimination inside Israel that would make any American raised in the era after civil rights blush. An apartheid reality that's been documented by almost every major international human rights organization, including, of course, the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, but also Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Palestinian human rights organizations. And again, all this before October 7th. How then to explain the continuing and continued overwhelming Western state and media support for Israel's, quote, right to defend itself after Palestinian guerrillas broke out of the ghetto of Gaza and attacked and killed Israeli soldiers, police, armed settlers, and yes, civilians as well, and committed atrocities on 7 October 2023. How to explain not just the erasure of crucial Palestinian context, but its substitution by another historical narrative that entirely vacates Palestinian history and humanity, to the point that Joe Biden would say after the attacks of October 7th that, quote, those attacks were, quote, as consequential as the Holocaust. My point, in other words, is not simply to draw your attention to what is being denied, removed from view, not talked about, because that's what Orientalism and the question of Palestine is all about, but something else. What is talked about? How one narrative of actual Palestinian history is utterly submerged by another Eurocentric, philo-Zionist one that forces Palestinians into the role of being the anti-Semitic persecutor of Jews, and at worst, neo-Nazis. My other point is to underscore the ethical and political consequences of this substitution and its history. This may explain, I think, this substitution, the removal of the Palestinian narrative and the substitution of a Eurocentric narrative, may explain why the obvious, that it's so apparent to anyone who has eyes, as I said, to see, why the obvious has been ignored, such as the fact that since 2007, Israel has waged 5, maybe 6, massive military assaults on Gaza since 2007, mowing the grass in Israeli parlance. These assaults have terrorized and traumatized an entire generation of children who compose, of course, as you know, nearly half of the population of the Gaza Strip, which itself is a product of the Nakba of 1948. And my talk may explain the fury and the self-righteousness of Western outrage at Palestinian violence, coded again as barbarism, and terrorism, and the Western justification for ever more violence and far greater violence committed by the state of Israel in the name of crushing violence that violence itself has produced and provoked. It may explain why advocates for Palestinian humanity, including Abu Said himself, remember, including the students at this university and my university and many different universities, are so often framed as anti-Semites, even as the stateless, brutalized, and persecuted Palestinians are being obliterated before our eyes, or why professors and administrators across this country thought it was acceptable to insinuate or condemn students standing in solidarity with Palestinians as hateful or even genocidal, or why it's been asserted time and again that Palestinians hate Israelis not because Israelis are their colonizers or settlers living on Palestinian land in close proximity to Palestinians who are confined to a ghetto in a new state that has made Palestinian life utterly miserable for decades, but because we are told again and again in the Western media, because Palestinians allegedly hate Israelis not because they're colonizers, but because they're Jews. Palestinians, in short, are reduced ultimately to anti-Semites, who thus deserve the terrible, devastating Israeli collective punishment and retribution. Even as you remember perfectly well in the months after October 7th, the very word ceasefire became heretical. We are now over 200 days into an unprecedented attack on humanity in the 21st century. I'm not going to go into all the details. You know what's happening in Gaza. You know that we have a famine, an engineered famine. We know that the mass destruction of universities, of schools, and so on and so forth. We know what's going on throughout Gaza, and we know the reaction on the part of higher administrations in this country to basically pretend that what's happening in Gaza is not actually happening. What's actually happening is a scourge of anti-Semitism on campuses. So why, the question ultimately is, why is it when things are so obvious, again, there's no more documented case of settler colonialism today than this case. Why is it that there are still so many people who apologize for, justify, and enable and perpetuate the first genocide in history to be live streamed when they actually have a choice to speak out, to write against genocide? Why is it that they choose to become mute witnesses? Why is it that they're so often paralyzed by fear, or worse, become its enthusiastic scribes and stenographers? Why? The simple answer, of course, takes us to history. What's happening now, the overwhelming Western state support for Israel and for Zionism and for Israel's total war against the Palestinians has exposed more clearly than ever a ruthless double standard that has always underlay Western support for Israel and for philozionism, or for Zionism. Jewish and Israeli history, the double standard is this: Jewish and Israeli history and life are cherished as part of an allegedly enlightened and civilized Western tradition, Western world. Muslim and Christian Palestinian history and life are fundamentally devalued. This double standard itself is obvious to us, but it has its own history. Protestant enthusiasts and theologians in Europe, in North America, had long fantasized from the 17th century onwards about the idea of a return of the Jews to biblical Palestine. But they had, as historians have documented over and over again, no actual history in the no actual interest in the actually existing diverse population of actual Palestine in the Ottoman era. In the 19th century, the Zionist Jewish nationalist movement, led by people like Herzl, emerged in Central and Eastern Europe among European Ashkenazi Jews. But it too, at first, largely ignored the native Palestinian population. Again, if you go back to Herzl's pamphlet, The Jewish State, there's no direct reference to the Palestinians as such. Part of this fact was geography. You need to remember, everyone needs to remember, that Zionism was not born among the ancient Jewish communities of the East, but in distant Europe. Its leaders were not Arab or Eastern or Sephardi Jews, but European Ashkenazi Jews. Herzl, then Chaim Weizmann, then David Ben-Gurion, then Golda Meir, Yitzhak Rabin, Menachem Begin, and so on and so forth. Its ethno-religious nationalist ideology was forged not by the pluralism of the Ottoman Empire or the Middle East, or the Islamic world, but rather by the competing racial and ethnic and linguistic nationalisms of Europe. The racial anti-Semitism of the West that was clearly one of the main catalysts for the development of European Jewish nationalism, was alien to the rhythms of religious difference and coexistence so familiar to the diverse inhabitants of the Ottoman Islamic East. So in other words, again, the crucial point, Zionism does not come out of the Ottoman Empire, it comes out of Europe, answering European questions and proposing European solutions. Recall as well that the Zionist project developed openly in the 19th century and early 20th century as a colonialist project in an era when European empires routinely segregated humanity into a hierarchy of superior and inferior races. So while leading Zionists grappled with racial anti-Semitism in Europe, they were also desperate to belong to this Europe. They expressed, shared, contributed to, and circulated many of the foundational 19th century racist tropes of Western culture, that the non-West was manifestly inferior, that the land of indigenous peoples was largely empty and thus open to colonization, that the removal of native peoples was inevitable or necessary. Recall Herzl's statement that the Jewish national state he dreamed of would become, quote, a rampart of a portion of Europe against Asia. Recall as well that the notorious slogan of the Zionist movement was a land without a people for a people without a land. And that slogan itself has Christian Zionist origins. The underlying point here is that both Christian and Jewish versions of colonial Zionism were predicated on solving Europe's Jewish question, in quotation marks, by removing or returning Jews en masse to Palestine, as if Palestinians, Muslims, and Christians did not exist or fundamentally did not matter. This obfuscation became ever more dangerous to Palestinians as Zionism moved from being colonial fantasy to colonial practice. And here, this is the point that oftentimes people tell us there are many forms of Zionism. It's true, there were many forms of Zionism, but once Zionism goes from Europe to Palestine, it becomes largely a colonial practice. The British Balfour Declaration of 1917 described, as you know, the Palestinians, who of course were the vast majority of the population at the time, merely as non-Jewish communities. who paled in historical, religious, and civilizational significance when compared to what the Balfour Declaration explicitly, if you can see over there, identified as the Jewish people, the more important Jewish people. Non-Jewish communities, Jewish people. There's a clear hierarchy even in the language that's being used. The British mandate over post-Ottoman Palestine that was established after the 1920 San Remo Agreement privileged foreign European Jewish Zionists legally, administratively, and politically. Native Muslim and Christian Palestinian bodies, nevertheless, were of course still present in Palestine. And they had, for the Zionists in particular, a tangibly unwelcome presence. Unlike the distant academic Protestant clergymen who had been obsessed with biblical prophecies and a certain colonial reading of the Bible, colonial Zionists were increasingly preoccupied with a far more secular Arab question that their own foreign European presence on the land of Palestine now invented. In other words, they go from trying to resolve a Jewish question in Europe to creating an Arab question in Palestine. How, in other words, and this Arab question is the following: how to transform a land actually inhabited by an overwhelming majority of Arabs into an exclusively Jewish state. As soon as Zionism moved from Christian and Jewish Western colonial fantasy to Western British colonial practice, Muslim and Christian Palestinians inevitably were seen. In other words, you're going from denial to a different kind of denial, where you actually see them right in front of you, and then you have to figure out what to do with it. Hence the Arab question. They were there on the land of Palestine, like Sekekini, with whom I began, like my great-grandfather, like so many other hundreds of thousands of people in villages, in towns, throughout Palestine. And as such, these natives constituted a real impediment to the successful unfolding of colonial Zionism. The more the Zionist state structure was put into practice by the Zionists with British colonial support during the British Mandate between 1920 and 1948, the more native anti-colonial resistance it generated. And this is, again, an important point. Native resistance took on many forms: pleading, letter writing, meeting, marching, demonstrating, rioting, major uprisings. The whole gamut of resistance was tried, and all of it was rejected. Native resistance, in turn, compelled Zionist colonists to grapple with this so-called Arab question, the morality of colonial Zionism. And the vast majority of the Zionists in Palestine in the 1920s and 1930s accepted what Vladimir Jabotinsky, or Ze'ev Jabotinsky's thinking that he outlined in his famous essay called The Iron Wall that he wrote in 1923. This essay basically was very, again, frank, that the Palestinians are natives, they're going to resist Zionism, and they have to be crushed. All hope has to be despoiled in order to create a successful Zionist project, hence the Iron Wall. The Arab resistance also compelled the British colonial rulers to figure out some way out of the inevitable conflict that their policies, their philo-Zionist mandate had actually created. In other words, there was no Arab-Jewish conflict until this moment. There certainly was no antonym between Arab and Jewish until this moment of the mandate. And so the way they tried to figure this out, how do you resolve this problem that the British had helped create because of their support for colonial Zionism, was ultimately partition of Palestine, despite the fact that the British from 1920, in fact, from 1917, the Balfour Declaration, all the way till the end of the mandate in 1948, said time and again that nothing shall be done which will prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities. That's straight out of the Balfour Declaration. So the British in 1937, skip this. The British in 1937 proposed the partition plan known as the Peel Partition, which was a scheme that foreshadowed the 1947 UN partition plan of Palestine. What you have to know again is that both plans, the Peel 1937 and the UN 47 plan, prioritized explicitly the making of a Jewish state, not a secular and democratic state. Both embraced as a central idea that the native Palestinian majority, which owned the vast majority of the land of Palestine and whose homes were in this land, on their own land, had to make way for the creation of a Jewish state that was both inevitable and necessary. The 1937 British Peel Partition Plan, in fact, admitted openly that there was going to be an injustice. There was going to be an injustice in the creation of any partition because they understood and they were explicit about this. This isn't, you can look this up, by the way, this partition plan, it's online. They said very clearly that there was no historically anti-Semitism in Palestine. They said that it's clear, if you see here, if you can follow, there's a typo in here, but that's from the thing. If you see, considering what the possibility of finding a refuge in Palestine means to many thousands of suffering Jews, is the loss occasioned by partition, great as it would be, more than Arab generosity can bear? In other words, the Arabs are a generous people, talk about Orientalism, and they're going to help us. They're going to help us solve Europe's Jewish question. And notice the end, what they say at the end. Whoops. Notice what they say at the end. How do I get rid of this bottom part?
You can drag it to a different place, like just drag on the block.
This thing? Oh, there we go. Okay. So you can see here, if the Arabs at some sacrifice, we're talking about having them give up their lands. If the Arabs at some sacrifice could help to solve that problem, they would earn the gratitude not of the Jews alone, but of all the Western world. This is 1937, by the way. This is the Peel Commission. So in other words, there's an extraordinary amount, you could say disingenuousness, you could say cognitive dissonance, you could say whatever you want. Plain old racism, Orientalism, whatever it is. The point is that they recognized in 1937 something that today many Zionists refuse to recognize, or have refused to recognize, that the creation of a Jewish state was going to come at the expense of the Palestinian natives. They were explicit about this. In 1938, right after the partition plan, right after the partition plan was published, the Arab scholar George Antonius, who really deserves a chair, maybe here at the Center for Arab Studies, named after him, the Arab scholar George Antonius called out the immoral morality of the so-called civilized world in his famous book called The Arab Awakening, that it was published again in English in 1938. In its final pages, Antonius wrote, "The treatment meted out to Jews in Germany and other European countries is a disgrace to its authors and to modern civilization. But posterity," he added, "will not exonerate any country that fails to bear its proper share of sacrifices needed to alleviate Jewish suffering and distress. To place the brunt of the burden upon Arab Palestine is a miserable evasion of the duty that lies upon the whole of the civilized world. It is also morally outrageous." End quote. You couldn't put it honestly, exactly, and that same, think about what's going on in Germany until today. Despite Antonius's pleas, US politicians rejected allowing the survivors of the Holocaust into the United States, just as Arthur Balfour himself had at the turn of the 20th century rejected Eastern European Jewish immigration into England. But more to the point, we should go back. This is what the Peel people said. This is what Churchill himself said in a totally, this was in the confidential testimony that he provided the same Peel commissioners, where he's explicit about what, in fact, so the Peel commissioners give you the Orientalist, polite, racist version. Here's the explicit version. "I don't agree," Churchill told the Peel commissioners, "that a dog in a manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time. I don't admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the Black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wide race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place." Explicit. So you have both the straight up confidential, this is what we really are doing, versus the Peel Commission, which is sort of giving it the more polite version. And Antonius calls them both out. Again, Antonius's plea was rejected. The US politicians who claimed to be so concerned with the displaced persons of Europe refused to allow them to come to the US, just as the British did as well. And so in November 1947, the UN, dominated of course by the colonial West and the Soviet Union, voted to partition Palestine and establish a Jewish state, despite the fact, again, that in 1947, the vast majority of the population was still Palestinian, and the fact that they were going to give the minority, almost all European-born, the Jewish community, the majority of the land of Palestine to create a Jewish state, despite centuries of Palestinian belonging and what had always been their land, their villages, their towns, their homes, their memories, and so on and so forth. I don't need to go into all the details about the Nakba of 1948 that destroyed Palestine and erased it literally from the map in the Western world, except to say that it obviously, from a Zionist perspective, resolved the problem of a majority of Palestinian bodies that prevented the creation of a viable Jewish state. Before, during, and after 1948, the Zionists expelled well over 800,000 Palestinians to neighboring lands. They expropriated their homes, their lands, their books, their properties, their archives. Khali Sakakini, whom I began this lecture with, was one of these individuals. He lost his property, his archives, his library. And this is the moment, of course, that the Gaza Strip that we hear so much about today was created as the Gaza Strip, amputated from the rest of historic Palestine. Now, what you need to also think about, and we need to think about, because this will explain then the whole Biden quotation that I began with, is why and how liberal Western states and leaders hailed the creation of an ethno-religious nationalist state in 1948 in a historically multi-religious land. Why did they do this in this moment? While Israeli leaders such as Chaim Weizmann spoke of, quote, a miraculous clearing of the land, and the state of Israel until this very moment denies any responsibility for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. In fact, it denies it. Leading American liberal figures in 1948, 49, 50, 51, 52, such as the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr and the co-author of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt, rationalized and justified the uprooting of the Palestinians. Niebuhr described the creation of Israel as, quote, a glorious spiritual and political achievement, and regarded Palestinians, quote, as Arabs who were inferior to Jews and whose suffering, though real, and displacement was lesser than the need to make way for a Jewish state that was so crucial to a post-war liberal theology. Eleanor Roosevelt, in turn, blamed the Palestinians for opposing their own displacement. Like Niebuhr, she justified her support for colonial Zionism by dehistoricizing what she regarded as primitive, irrational, and aggressive Arabs. The point is not just the racism and Orientalism directed at Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims. The point is that World War II, the creation of Israel in 1948, reflected more than just settler colonialism and more than just racism and an ideology of what Patrick Wolf calls elimination of the natives, the logic of elimination. There's something else going on. The support for Israel in the West, the identification with Israel, reflected post-war humanism, Western post-war humanism that was reborn after World War II with a philo-Zionist core. So my former colleague at Rice University, I have to give credit to for this, is historian Daniel Cohen, and he has a forthcoming book on this topic called Philo-Semitism in Europe Since the Holocaust. In this book, Cohen shows in painstaking detail how in the wake of World War II, European philosophical, religious, and moral concerns and preoccupation and thinking about man, of course, white Western man, was predicated on the recognition of the history of anti-Semitism that had culminated with the rise of Nazism. In other words, they were grappling with the wreckage and the horrors of Nazism and the destruction of Europe and of Western civilization. The creation of Israel as a Jewish state, therefore, in the minds of these European philo-Zionists, liberals, even leftists, represented an implied Western atonement for its own terrible past of anti-Semitism. So that the state even of Germany would in 1953 give Israel reparations. So Israel becomes this idea that it's atoning for the history of anti-Semitism and, of course, the horrors of the Holocaust. In this philo-Zionist turn, to love Jews and Judaism, therefore, was to love the new state of Israel that was established in their name. Palestinians, again, as Antonius pointed out in 1938, simply did not figure in this moral calculus. They were, again, made invisible. So from being invisible in the 19th century to being visibilized as an Arab question, they suddenly become invisible again after 1948, when they simply become dehistoricized refugees. It's not a coincidence that the great Black anti-colonial poet and writer Aimé Césaire castigated this post-World War II Western conception of the rights of man as, quote, pseudo-humanism at this moment in 1955 in a book he entitled Discourse on Colonialism. Césaire was not writing about Palestinians per se, but more broadly about the Arabs in Algeria, the Blacks in South Africa, in Madagascar, and in the Caribbean, the Vietnamese and other indigenous peoples of the world. Césaire noted how this Western pseudo-humanism was based on what he called a narrow and fragmentary, and what he called also a sordidly racist conception of the rights of man. He was disgusted, in other words, by how post-war European states and intellectuals and politicians were willing to finally condemn Hitler and anti-Semitism, which was the good thing, but they refused, these same people refused to condemn colonialism. They refused to abandon most of their colonial possessions without a bitter and sustained fight. Instead, by splitting the fight against anti-Semitism, which the post-war West now deplored, from that against racism and segregation and colonialism more broadly, which the post-war West continued to uphold with extraordinary violence, one could love Israel on the one hand, and allegedly Jews, and still hate Arabs and Blacks and migrants. One could love the now largely absent Jews of Europe and love them instead in their new, and in the eyes of the Western philo-Zionists, proper home in Israel. Palestinians, again, be damned. There's no Palestinians. They don't figure in this moral calculus. That's my interpretation of Césaire. This Western denial of an ancient, sustained, and meaningful Palestinian relationship to Palestine has obviously had profoundly corrosive moral, political, and ethical effects. It's led to a series of philo-Zionist dogmas that continue to shape how current events are viewed and interpreted across the West. In fact, it helps us understand what's going on today. The most important of these dogmas is not to dare question Israel as a Jewish state, no matter what such a state does or implies to the native Muslim and Christian Palestinian survivors of the Nakba, who remain until now condemned at best to be precarious second-class citizens of a state that does not want them. Recall that these Palestinian survivors constitute 20% of Israel's current population. So I'm talking about the citizens inside of Israel itself. Unwanted, an unassimilable minority that cannot be part of the national body politic. Nearly 5 million other Palestinians live in various humiliating states of unfreedom, as everyone knows, stateless non-citizens, under what the major human rights organizations, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, call apartheid, whether it's in East Jerusalem, occupied, of course, the West Bank, and most obviously the Gaza Strip. And still millions of other Palestinians remain in exile, unable to return to their homes because they are not Jewish. Yet to question the professed Jewishness of a state, despite the blatant racism that this state practices to its non-Jewish subjects and citizens, remains largely unthinkable across the liberal West. For to question colonial Zionism is to question the sincerity and the implications of the West's alleged turn on its own anti-Semitic past. Since the West has done this equation, anti-Semitism, Holocaust, Israel. You can't, in the Western mind, this is how this, not the Western mind, in this Western sort of ethos, this is how this works, this equation. And they work together, and it's all predicated on denying the Palestinians. So if you question the Jewishness of the state of Israel and say you want a secular state, you undermine a sort of a telos of atonement. The second philo-Zionist dogma that shapes the contours of post-war Western humanism, again, and this helps us understand why there's so much self-righteousness in the Western condemnation of Palestinians, was to regard Israel very much as an extension of an idealized West. So the Jewish Israeli pioneers, the Palestinians. Israelis had classical music, European institutions, a modern army, quote, the most moral army, remember that, pioneers, communal kibbutzes, and above all, a young nation that contrasted with the background images of nameless, squalid Arab refugees. Israel was what the West wanted and needed after World War II, an emancipated part of itself allegedly purged of its historical anti-Semitism. In the 1950s, therefore, it wasn't as much the conservatives and the right wing, but Western liberals and leftists who overwhelmingly and enthusiastically supported Israel, despite its treatment of the largely invisibilized Palestinians. This included Western trade unions, liberal theologians, radicals, socialists, and liberals. They supported Zionism. The third dogma was to make actual Palestinians unrelatable to Western humanism, except, as Edward Said pointed out in Orientalism, as a negative value. and to represent Palestinians either as sullen, dehistoricized refugees, or equally dehistoricized, enraged, and violent people who violate the very core of post-war Western humanism because they oppose colonial Zionism. Stripped of context, history, and lived experience, the Palestinians have been made into beings who cannot love, only hate. They are people without history. Palestinians are cast, in fact, outside of proper historical consciousness. They appear to return only to threaten what has been in reality an artfully and irredeemably Eurocentric telos of a sanctified Israel blessed by the West. After 1948, in any case, the Zionist movement coalesced around the new state of Israel and steadily invested in building up a remarkable lobbying presence, which is not simply political donations, but it's actual social movements in every Western major state, especially in the United States. It's impossible not to recognize the degree to which the Zionist movement and the Israeli state have mobilized Jewish communities and sought to make Zionist ideology hegemonic among them. Their axiom was that to be Jewish had to be Zionist, and to feel, think, and believe that the state of Israel, the state itself, represented the entirety of the Jewish people. And on this exact point, there's a film that just came out, a documentary called Israelism, which actually sort of explains this in some detail in an American context. The affective, positive, emotional relationship to Israel was reinforced by a campaign of memorialization of the Holocaust across the liberal West, especially after 1967. And again, so you have these extraordinary, often incredibly beautiful and moving and haunting sort of memorials of the horrors of Nazism and anti-Semitism in Europe. But all these things are predicated on the illusion, as George Antonius foreshadowed in 1938, of making the Palestinians collectively pay the heaviest price for the creation of a Jewish state, even though they had no hand in Nazism or in Western-style anti-Semitism. The collective result of all this, and I'm coming to the end here, is an echo chamber of furious, self-righteous morality that again was overwhelmingly in evidence after October 7th. There's a self-righteousness that is predicated, as I've said from the outset, on obfuscation and the substitution of one narrative for another. Recall that Israel was established and legitimated by Western-dominated UN just as the era of Western colonialism was drawing to an end, and just as it was drawing its final breaths before the great age of decolonization. Only the denialism of Palestinian history and humanity can sustain the extraordinary self-congratulatory discourse about Israel and the liberal West that you still hear until now, about its shared values, about it being both a Jewish and democratic state, about making the desert bloom, that Israel as a state has a right to exist, not people, not individuals, not human beings, but a state has a right to exist, that it has the most moral army and so on and so forth, all of which is totally disconnected from the reality of the Palestinian experience. And at the same time, nowhere is the anachronism of a colonizing state more obvious than in Israel today in the 21st century. Because again, politically, what the Israeli generals and politicians say about Palestinians, what Israeli citizens say about Palestinians, is in fact completely unfiltered. Human animals, children of darkness, chanting death to the Arabs, and calling for severe epidemics, as an former Israeli general wrote on November 19. All these, as well as there being a political party in Israel called Jewish Power, led by people who fundamentally and openly say that this is a land only for the Jewish people. And so there's a mountain of evidence before us, again, of a state of anachronism. And yet Israel is given pass time and again because of the narrative that suggests that a state built on another people's land represents the mantle of post-Holocaust anti-Semitic piety and morality and the redemption of Western humanism. And so it's there, right there, and that narrative remains incredibly powerful, and it gets summed up in the word anti-Semitism. So when people accuse everyone of anti-Semitism, what they're doing is they're recalling this older history. a real history, of course, of persecution, but displaced to Palestine. And no matter what the Palestinians do, as I said, no matter what they do, they're always on the margins. And the more they violently resist, the more they're compared and they're demonized as Nazis. Decontextualized and dehistoricized, Palestinian resistance to the Jewish state is felt, seen, and sensed in the liberal West as a terrible reincarnation of a demonic anti-Semitic past. Such a view allows even privileged Zionists in Israel and across the West to believe themselves to be the real victims, even as Palestinians are being slaughtered before our eyes and before the world. Hence, the constant misleading refrain that the bloody events of October 7th were, quote, the deadliest attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. We've heard this time and again. Hence the constant conflation of Palestinian freedom with anti-Jewish hatred. Again, think about how our students are constantly being depicted as hate-filled people. Hence, the racist Israeli historian Benny Morris says in an extraordinary interview from 2004, although I don't think he's ever renounced this interview, he says, yes, we're oppressing the Palestinians. Yes, we carried out the ethnic cleansing. We should have done more ethnic cleansing. He said that's the great fault of David Ben-Gurion. But he ends by saying, although we're oppressing the Palestinians, quote, we are the greater victims in the course of history. We are also the greater potential victim, even though we're oppressing the Palestinians, we are the weaker side here, says Benny Morris. Narcissism, denial, cognitive dissonance, call it what you will, but it's all, again, predicated on a denial of significant Palestinian history and humanity. And that's where we are. And that's where we remain until this very moment. The myth, this sort of incredible narrative, is being challenged now by younger generations. There's no question that this myth is being challenged. The question is that historians need to think about is why at this moment, and how does this history that I've tried to lay out, how does that fit in with this current moment? Because you see a certain generation of people using this older narrative to suppress and demonize and stereotype and defame students and faculty and staff. But it doesn't seem to have the same kind of power, or maybe it does. Time will tell. That's where we are right now in this crossroads. Some people are trying to turn back the clock by pretending that colonial Zionism is in fact defensible, as if Israel or Zionism can be thought of today without Palestinians and without centrally reckoning with Zionism from, as Edward Said again said, the standpoint of its victims. And yet here we are, the crucible of Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, more clearly than any previous moment in the history of Palestinian tribulations, exposes damning evidence of the moral and political failure, both of colonial Zionism and of the support of colonial Zionism in the West. It can no longer be obfuscated. That's, I think, where the crisis is. It exposes, well, an ignorance, a narcissism, a depravity of many of the secular and religious supporters of Israel in the West. Because unlike the Nakba of 1948, when, for the most part in the West, people didn't have to see the Palestinians, there was no social media, things weren't live streamed. It took months to get the news and the reports, or weeks to get the news and the reports of what happened. And the Israeli state denied what they did until decades after with the archives. Today, it's all being live streamed. It's all being live streamed. And so all of us, each of us has a choice to make as scholars, as students, as faculty, as staff, as people with a conscience and ethics. Where do we want to stand in this struggle? And on which side of history do we want to stand? In the past or with the future? And to me, it seems fairly clear where we should stand. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to pose the first question, and then if you want to pose a question, please raise your hand and we'll get to as many of them as we can. We'll try and end in about half an hour. So the first question, Ussama, I want to push back a little bit on your interpretation of the support that exists in the West for Zionism. I think we're in the middle of a major shift that's taking place. I think 10 years ago, it would be impossible to imagine on university campuses this type of solidarity with Palestinians. And a friend of mine pointed out an observation that the core base of support for Israel right now and for Zionism is no longer on the left as it used to be. when you characterize it in the post 1948 era, it was widely, people who are progressive, who are left liberals, who are I would argue that much of that support, not all of it, but much of that has abandoned. And now the core base of support in the West is on the right, in many ways on the fanatic right, the GOP, the Trump camp, these populist sort of politicians in different countries. That suggests to me that things are moving in the right direction in terms of a historical reconciliation over what happened in 1948. So would you agree with that, or could you comment on this shift that's taking place seemingly, or have I misread what's going on?
I don't know I hope you haven't misread. No, I don't know if you've misread what's going on. All I know is that I would agree in part with what you said. I would say that there certainly is you can see the shift. We can see the shift happening in our campuses.
Yeah.
We can see the shift happening around the world. We can see the shift happening among youth. You can certainly see it, and you can see it as a shift from the liberals to the right. That's one way of interpreting it. On the other hand, you could also say everything depends. I mean, it's not just the right-wing governments or the rightist governments, Hungary and Argentina today or whatever, that are supporting Israel. It's every single Western liberal state that supported Israel. Virtually every single West, with the exception of Ireland and Spain or whatever right now. So there's a shift taking place, but it's not as dramatic or as total. That's one answer. The second point, of course, is that Western academia, I mean, that's where we are right now in Western academia. Every single institution, not just conservative institutions, all those institutions that claim to be in favor of diversity, equity, and inclusion, have each and every single one that I'm aware of, virtually every single one, condemned without reservation October 7th. Yet not a single one, not a single university anywhere has said anything about the destruction of every single university in Gaza. Let's go out, not a word. Not a word. So when you say there's a shift, there is a shift taking place, yes, but I don't think the shift is as total as we, I think it's a generational shift, but I think ultimately the great issue is that the Christian Zionists and the right, the House Committee, for example, would be far more sort of exposed for what it is if liberal Zionists weren't actually sitting there and giving it the kind of, they're just, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's the one issue where Christian Zionists are not called out. On every other issue, abortion, stem cell research, education, all these issues, the Christian Zionists are called out for what they are, except on Israel, where you have Biden and the Christians. What's the difference between Trump and Biden on Israel? That's the point. So when that shift takes place, then there'll be a shift. So yes, there is a shift taking place, but it's not as total. And plus, remember, the shift now is, the last point I'd say is that it's all about a ceasefire. People are calling for an end to genocide. They're not yet calling for liberation of Palestine. And there's a difference, because in the end, you can call an end to the genocide, which of course is absolutely necessary. But that in and of itself, that's absolutely essential. But that's just the immediate issue. The question is, okay, then what? Is that shift going to continue to the point of understanding, okay, where did we get to this problem? That's
okay. Let's take some questions. Okay, Donish is first, and then we'll take them one at a time as your hands emerge in the air. Go ahead.
I'm visiting researcher here at the Ideological Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. First of all, thank you so much for a riveting discussion. I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about the phenomenon of doxing. I agree that we are seeing a turning point, but there is also a very visceral reaction to that turning point. A concerted effort, both to faculty and now to students, to ruin lives and ruin careers. I wonder if you could say a bit about how to deal with doxing, both for yourself as a faculty member and to students who are facing the same thing.
Well, that's not the topic of my, you probably know, there are people in this room who can answer the question just as well as I. I would say, first of all, doxing is not, I don't think it's unique to the Palestinian case, right? This is, in any struggle for justice, you're going to have a reaction and a backlash. And the backlash takes the forms of defamation, denigration, racism, harassment, in some cases, killing. We know the history of this country. From civil rights and before and after, it's been like this always. And so the only thing I could say, it's not, again, as an individual, as a person, doxing is not, they know our position, my position, that's not going to stop us. But of course, students should be aware of what they're doing, but it's not for me to tell students you have to do this or this or this, but be aware of what the consequences are. But there's no such thing in the end, there's no such thing as a struggle for genuine change without facing this kind of backlash, or else it's not really. Do you see what I'm saying? When you can't fight the struggle within the contours just of rhetoric. There's something else going on. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm a historian. I want to take you back to history.
Yeah, please.
So you pointed out that part of the problem is this historical mindset that is used to read the displacement now the genocide of Palestinians, that is kind of predicated on the post-Second World War. And again, I'm trying to bring my ideas to you. What would be kind of the corrective, again, as historians, to that historical mindset? Like, how could we, because obviously this is a toxic historical mindset that's playing out everything you see on the lives of the blood and skin of Palestinians today. So what would be the miracle? I mean, I just want to hear from you, what would be kind of the counter historical mindset that we should kind of put forth in its place?
What I just told you.
Yeah.
I mean, so the history, first of all, the history of obviously the history of coexistence.
Yeah.
That's absolutely crucial. A critical history of coexistence, which many others have tried to do. Judith here and many others, Professor Tucker, I should say, I apologize, and many others have tried to do, like a dynamic history of a rich, pluralistic, sort of complicated, complex, contradictory, multi-religious Middle East, Maghreb, including Palestine. That's the most obvious antidote, and that's the Achilles heel of the Zionists. I mean, there's a reason why Zionists today, scholars and sort of advocates, especially on campuses, never come and debate. They never come and actually argue with, in my experience, they used to. Now they're much more reticent to come and argue because the history is so clear. It's crystal clear. The Israeli archives they have also revealed, Israeli historians like Ilan Papi and others have revealed a vast sort of history of displacement, ethnic cleansing, massacres, Tantura, and all these other things. The history is incontrovertible. And you go back to the mandate, you said, look at the mandate structures. They can't argue. It's very difficult to argue because the facts are Palestinians have never been afraid of history. And the Palestinian narrative doesn't require this artifice of deception on the land without a people for people. It's just very simple. We're here. We belong. We have rights. So narrating the history, historical narration is one critical terrain, but you have to do it as a scholar and you have to do it, honestly, and all that stuff with all the complexity. That's one terrain. And the other terrain is just not allowing the other side to frame the debate constantly as one of anti-Semitism. And this is what they're trying to do now with the students. The whole question, is it that is a question that the other side is posing to frame debate on terms that where it pushes you on the defensive. We're not, but it's not about what we're not, it's about what are we advocating for. You see what I'm saying? So those are the two ways.
Yeah, I mean, I see that, but I'm just wondering how would it be empowered? Like, because I know, like, where it's been in kind of.
You mean in the academy? How would it be empowered?
Beyond the academy.
I mean, it's happening already. I mean, you can see a shift taking place among academics, among journalists, but they're all in the margins right now. For the most part, in the margins. I mean, there are exceptions, but for the most part, it's on the margins, not the mainstream media. But again, we're talking about a generational shift taking place. A generational shift means that we have to wait a decade or two to see what the effects are of this moment going forward. Because remember, the people who are advocating today for Zionism have been subjected to this narrative that I've been telling you about and have been indoctrinated in this narrative. That is an extraordinarily compelling narrative. Think of Schindler's List as a film that many of you will remember. Think of the last scenes in Schindler's List after the, I don't know if you remember this, Dave. Okay, if you go back, and that's 1993 Oscar-winning movie, so it shapes a generation in the way that previously Exodus shaped a different generation. Mm-hmm. These are pivotal moments that help to shape a narrative. But again, there's no Palestinian. They're simply not there. It's entirely a Eurocentric, obviously, it's about the Holocaust. But at the end, the survivors are told, you have no place here in Europe. They still hate you here. You can't go to the West, i.e. America. You have to go over there to your homeland, basically, to Palestine, to Israel, what would become Israel. And it's all, again, it's a closure to this history of anti-Semitism, but again, predicated on the absence of Palestinians. Today, it's changing because first of all, there are many more Palestinians in the West, there are many more Muslims in the West, there are many more allies in the West, students of all faiths. And they humanize the Palestinian. That's going to help change, I think, the narrative.
Judith?
Yeah, it's kind of a related question, I think, and it's really about the sort of frantic attempts by some historians to find, Palestinian anti-Semitism in and around the Second World War, and Antonius Husseini and the Nazis and so forth. And even today we have a kind of a Middle East organization that offers a Bernard Lewis Prize for work on anti-Semitism, for work on Arab anti-Semitism scholarship. So I think my question is it worth engaging this? Or do you think that basically just focusing on what is the real narrative is the way to go?
I think they work. I think there's no way to not engage in the sense, it's like asking, should we engage with Orientalism? We don't have a choice. We're responding to it, whether we do it directly or indirectly.
How should we engage it? This would be the.
Yeah, again, by first of all, just pointing out, you point out the most, when I tell like audience, but you tell them, but Zionism didn't emerge in the Middle East among the indigenous ancient Jewish communities of the Middle East. Why? They're stumped. A lot of these people never even thought about that point. It's such a basic point, but you tell them, why is that? Why do you think that is? And then you point out that there was no Jewish question in the Ottoman Empire. There was an Eastern question. There was a question of minorities, i.e. the Armenians. There was a persecution of Armenians. There was a genocide of the Armenians, but there's no Jewish question as such. That is as the British themselves and as the Zionists themselves recognized was a European question, which again, in Eurocentric universalizing racial logic means it's the world's question because it's a European question. As far as Hajj Amin and all this business of the fixation with Hajj Amin, of course, has been a Zionist trope for decades. We know that. And the best way for me to answer it is to say, yeah, absolutely, that there are some reprehensible things that Palestinians have, that Hajj Amin said and did. But that's distraction. You're focusing on the end result rather than on the actual history itself of Palestine. That's what I would say. So I don't engage in denial because I think it's just, there's no point. Just go straight up and say, yeah. And there were far greater racists, frankly, in the West.
But the absurdity of the Hajj al-Amin Husseini narrative has gotten to such a level where you saw that clip from Netanyahu where he says that.
But Netanyahu himself is absurd.
Right.
I mean, so my point is like, Netanyahu himself, nobody takes Netanyahu, like honestly, no scholar I know, no student who's got a remote would take Netanyahu seriously, especially now.
Yeah.
So whatever he said, let him say it. I mean, he's a politician and he's a venal, corrupt politician.
Yeah. Okay, we have a gentleman in the second row and then you're next. So go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ussama. You were brilliant. My name is Suleiman Basti and I'm a friend of Palestine. I'm proud of my alma mater, Cornell, with the faculty and the staff have come out. Two fictitious things have happened. One is it's no longer seen as an Arab-Israeli conflict. It's a Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I have no love lost with these Arab talk, dictators or the Hamis or whatever it is. The second one is the emergent, the decline, the failure of that Fukuyama doctrine, the end of history, which he basically brought it for the American century and other things. The emergent rise of a multipolar world. I am proud of what Putin and China and Iran are doing. And the only stable international order throughout the world history has been a balance of power. And so this America has been totally isolated. And this is, I'm very, very keen and happy about it. Any comments?
What was the first point? The first point was
Arab-Israeli.
oh, why it's an Arab-Israeli.
Not an Arab Israeli, but Palestinian Israeli.
Well, I think that's not true. I think first of all, it's not. I wouldn't. Another point for everyone: stop calling it a conflict.
Yeah.
It's not, and I refuse at Berkeley. I don't teach a course called the Palestinian-Israeli or Arab-Israeli conflict. I call it a history of Palestine, or Palestine and the Palestinians in modern history. Focus on that because that way you get around this business of fixating everything about a conflict. And then, even though of course you can't escape, there's no way to talk about modern Palestinian history without Zionism, because it's shaped and reshaped and affected and distorted and devastated Palestinian life and society. But it's not. But there is, there are Arab states that have surrendered. There's an Arab facade, of course, that the British created after World War I. to basically sort of get around the idea of self-determination by creating this facade of Arab states that do British colonial will, but via proxies, i.e. the Hashemites and others, the Saudis and all these other states, and that are there to sort of maintain a Western British colonial and US colonial power, but behind a facade of Arab sovereignty. So what we see today is sort of an elaboration of that British idea of an Arab facade, which was a British term. But that doesn't mean that the vast majority of the Arab world and the vast majority of the Islamic world, I would wager, instinctively understand Palestine as a cause of justice. In the Arab world, whether you're Christian or Muslim, whether you're poor or rich, whether you're Sunni or Shia, it's almost universal, a sense and an understanding that Palestine is a core ethical issue. It's a moral compass. It doesn't mean that it's the only issue. It doesn't mean that there aren't complications. It doesn't mean that people don't disagree vehemently about what to do and how to proceed. It doesn't mean that people all support Hamas or Fatah or Hizb or whatever, but it's a core issue. So in that sense, I think anyone who thinks that the Arab region as a region is not overwhelmingly pro-Palestinian is in La La Land. It's in a think tank land, maybe that in DC they like, but that's not. And I remember Paul Salem and others like years ago would talk about the end of the Arab-Israelis now in the Iranian-Arab conflict, whatever. That's all. That's at the level of states. There is a Palestinian-Israeli conflict, if you want to call it that. It's really a Zionist. It's a Zionist versus freedom struggle, and on the side of the Palestinians are people of all faiths, including, of course, many anti-Zionist or non-Zionist Jews, Jewish Voice for Peace, and other people. So you see that around. So it's not. Again, it's really important to explain to people that this is really a core ethical issue. It's a global issue now as well. There's a reason why students of all faiths are on to Palestine, because first of all, the anachronism of what Israel is, like the kind of racism and colonialism, the things we read about when it comes to US history, and non-Western history, we read about this kind of colonial regime, apartheid. These are things that in South Africa ended decades ago. Here it is playing out before our eyes. So students are not stupid. They understand, and your students here in the US, they understand, they read and they put one and one together and they say, okay, there's a problem here. So that's where I see things going.
Yeah, young man at the front. Sorry, you're next, and then we're going to take a question online, and then you're next. Go ahead. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Rafael Velez. I'm a second-year student here at Partition SFS. And my question, it's a simple question, but it might lie a little bit outside of the scope of this discussion. But you mentioned how it's important for students and activists and everybody to not just merely advocate for a ceasefire, but for Palestinian liberation. In your opinion,
For human liberation.
Human liberation. In your opinion, how does that liberation look like? Would it look like, recuperating all the land that Palestinians had before? How would it look like in your opinion?
It's important. The point is to focus with laser sharpness, to focus on the issue of injustice and inequality. And then the question is, okay, so what solutions put the onus on those who are opposing? In other words, I'm completely opposed to any system of segregation, any system of apartheid, any system of ethno-religious supremacy in any part of the world, including in Israel, of course. Why should that be allowed to stand? You see what I'm saying? That system is just like the Jim Crow South ended without the South ending, just like apartheid South Africa ended without South Africa ending, so too should the system of colonial oppression of Palestinians simply because they're non-Jews. That shouldn't be that. Why should anyone advocate? And if you do advocate for that, say what you're advocating for. As for the solution, that's for politicians to figure out. And there's a million different ways, but ultimately it has to be based on the idea of secular equality. Everybody has to be equal. That's a core value. That's my core value. Everyone has their own perspective, I guess.
Could you read us a question from online, and then we'll move forward? Go ahead.
Yeah, so this is from Renee Fu. And this person says, in the face of Western complicity for the decades of Israel-Palestine conflict, what would be the appropriate international response to the crisis? Would localization of the reconciliation process be preferred, or do international actors need to accept a level of responsibility?
Well, I mean, that's a tough question. I'm not sure I understand the question. The responsibility is obviously first and foremost on the state of Israel for the genocide and the Western states, including the US, that's backing, funding, equipping, justifying, apologizing, sustaining, enabling, continuing the genocide, frankly. Beyond that, what we see is very clear. We see it's not a question of it's a question of constant mobilization. That's the only hope that any of us have, is constant mobilization at multiple levels to put pressure to change what is an extraordinarily unjust, unconscionable form of oppression that none of us, I wager, none of us, however old we are, however young we are, have ever seen played out in this way. I've never, in my wildest imagination, I never thought I would see this level of depravity played out live streamed, because there's never been a genocide caught on social media in this way before. And so for all of us, there's a new reality that we have to contend with. So, and again, historians are going to eventually write about this. And I can assure you they're going to write about this with the same horror that they write today about what King Leopold did in the Belgian Congo and other places, with the same shock, and yet not realize that there are people who read about King Leopold's Congo, said they were completely opposed to that, but then supported this. That's what we need to account for. Yeah, go ahead.
So this is a strictly history question. Like in the 1947 partition plan called for a Palestinian state,
Or for an Arab state.
but in those ways, but it ended up after the war with like Egyptian intervening and control. How did that happen? And were there people? How did that finish happen? And were there people who were arguing against it and for like?
Yeah, of course. There was a huge debate in the UN. The UN partition, as I said, in 1947, the UN UNSCOP, the UN Special Committee on Palestine, had a majority report that proposed the partition of Palestine, the mandate of Palestine, into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. It gave the Jewish minority, mostly European-born, the majority of the land. On the idea, as I said, because the priority for UNSCOP was to create a Jewish state and to resolve the question of displaced persons in Europe as well, the whole question of what to do with the survivors of the Holocaust. And so that was the thinking that shaped how they were going to approach this. That was the priority for them. And then you had a minority report, including the state of India, which was, of course, newly independent at this time, which basically argued against this idea of partitioning Palestine. And they said this should remain a single state, a federated state, where you can at least address the idea of self-determination within a concept of a single state without displacing people. And that, in that sense, and of course, the Arab states themselves, the independent Arab states at the time, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Iraq, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, those were the states, are the ones who advocated and argued vociferously at the UN, at the newly formed UN, against the injustice of partition, because they pointed out that you're partitioning somebody else's land. And ultimately, it's the Palestinians who are the landowners who are being asked to give up their lands to make way for a Jewish state. And they pointed out, as Antonius had pointed out in 1938, so a decade before, the hypocrisy of the Western position, which is that we're going to resolve this question at the expense of the Palestinians, but we at the West are not going to do anything in terms of giving up our lands to make way, even though anti-Semitism is a Western, had been an overwhelmingly Western problem. So yes, there was opposition. There was huge opposition, as it was inevitable, because it's such an unjust, inherently prejudicial plan to the natives of Palestine. The Zionists then, of course, seized upon the partition plan, and there was a war, as historians have now documented. And the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians took place before the Arab-Israeli War of 1948 in May broke out. The massacre of Deir Yassin was in April 1948. The ethnic cleansing started before, and it continued after the war ended in 1948. And the Arab states intervened because they were pushed to intervene by their own, again, popular sentiment. There was huge popular sentiment against the injustice of Palestine and what was happening to the Palestinians, but they were ill-equipped, and they sent their sort of various contingents to fight in Palestine, including Abdel Nasser in Egypt, and they were all defeated. And Egypt ended up in control of the Gaza Strip itself. It administered the Gaza Strip from 48 until 67.
Okay, there was a couple of questions at the back. We'll take maybe three questions. 1, 2, and then 3, and we'll try and wrap it up. Go ahead.
My name is Salma. I'm a student here at Georgetown, and I've been at the encampment since it started on Thursday. And I want your opinion and advice on a few things that I've noticed with the students. So a lot of people are telling some of us that, the language that we use is a bit radical, that we're using such a colonialism, that we reject to bring the settler colonial situation as conflict, and that we really need to speak to the masses, especially at this moment when students are kind of leading the movement, and that people are now listening. And for me, I've been in the US since 2004, and I feel like we've been talking to the public and the masses since then. I mean, when I used to protest when I was in my undergrad, we would never use these languages. We would never talk about one state or that we don't want settlers in Palestine. And now clearly there is shift, but I'm not sure if that is the right strategy, or are we still talking to the masses? I feel there is acceptance in academia to use these historical contexts as we should. But outside, the minute you talk about settler colonialism, you're kind of boxed or compartmentalized as a leftist radical, as if all these things are bad labels. And then the other thing that I noticed is that some journalists, instead of really centering the demands that the students want in terms of divestment, boycott, and sanctions, they're asking us, so are you with the two-state? And then, okay, but when you say one state, I mean, the old idea of the destruction of Israel, killing all Jews, and you try to explain, and I'm wondering, do we want to engage in the solutions debate, or is our role as students should be put in a more historical context? I'm a bit struggling to bridge the gap.
Yeah, very good questions that speak to our contemporary moment. Just to rephrase the question, if I haven't mistaken it, is can you reach a broad audience by using the paradigm of settler colonialism when you're advocating for an end to the horrors in Gaza right now?
Well, I mean, settler colonialism, of course, is also an academic concept. I mean, there's a huge literature now. There's a scholarship on settler colonialism that has its own sort of coherence, its own sort of vocabulary, its own sort of ideas. And so I think if you're engaging with that, engage with that. I mean, in the end, you're students. You're not just activists. You're students and activists. You're both at the same time. So, use whatever language. I think in the end, you have to debate and argue and think for yourselves. And it's not for me to tell you what to do or what to say, but I wouldn't shy away from any of these. Anyone who tells you, don't say this because you're going to alienate, are the same people who weren't saying anything until you started mobilizing. So that's so I'm not here to lecture. I will never lecture students and tell them, unless they're doing something wrong that I feel is unethical, then I would say, don't do that. I wouldn't do that. But in terms of debates, you have to figure out, you have a much better sense based on who you're arguing with, who you're discussing. In terms of the two-state thing, look, what I say that's why I'm always opposed to this. I don't want to think about a solution. That's not my job to think about a solution, other than saying there has to be ethical principles that underlay a solution, equality. And so when people say two-state, what they're doing, of course, when politicians say it, they're just avoiding. It's simply distraction. They're throwing sand in our eyes. They mean nothing. They just mean we don't want to deal with it right now. And when Zionists say two-state, what they really mean is that they want to protect the idea of a Jewish state. That's what they mean. And so you push them and say, okay, but what does a Jewish state mean to the non-Jewish citizens? Should they be, who are 20% of the population of Israel? Should they remain perpetually second-class citizens? Is that right? Would you accept that? So push them. Don't allow them to frame the question on terms that allow them to not explicate what, in fact, it is they're arguing for. If they want a supremacist state, let them argue for it. If they want a segregationist state, let them argue for it. If they want a secular state, let them argue for it. But you see what I'm saying? So don't let people say two-state and get away, because that's just a way of distraction. That's it.
Let's take the last two questions back to back. So 1, 2, okay, last 3 questions in sequence. So and then we'll get Ussama to answer them. Go ahead.
It's wonderful to hear you speak. You've been reading a lot of your pieces in our classes, so it's really cool to meet you in person. I wanted to come back to what you're talking about of the long history of coexistence, the importance of sharing this coexistence and the history of that, especially in the Middle East, and showing that anti-Semitism, as imported by the West, wasn't native to the Middle East. However, even that being said, there's certainly a history of manipulation by the colonial regimes of these societies in the Middle East, and we've seen that. So something about Husseini in North Africa as well, the Vichy French regimes and the German regimes incited violence between either North African Muslims and Jews or Christians and Jews, and it certainly did affect the societies, and so it created real fear. And I think similarly today, even in the protests, the intentions are there, the students are doing the right thing, we're on the right side of history here, but that doesn't mean that these voices aren't being manipulated, and sometimes they're manipulated by, as you said, the Zionist regimes that are pushing for, like, it benefits the Israeli government really to say, like, look, these people are anti-Semitic, these students are protesting. But there is still anti-Semitism, and if there wasn't, then there wouldn't be this real fear among Jewish students or among Jews in America. So how do we combat that manipulation of speech? And is there a way that we, like, obviously there's Jewish students, there's people of all faiths that are in these protests and in these universities and writing about these things. And there's historians that have covered all of this from all different faiths. So how do we combat the manipulation that's creating that real fear among students and just citizens in US today or people all over the world?
Okay, thank you. Sir, you're next.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Do you want to answer it or let's get three, let's go three. No, go ahead with your question and then we'll get them all at the end collectively. Go ahead.
I'd like you to comment on Jewish-Israeli demographics. And what I have in mind is the population of Jewish population of Israel aging, and who is leaving Israel and who is going to Israel. One thing that I've heard, for example, is that more Israelis have emigrated to the United States from Israel than Americans have gone to Israel from the United States.
Okay, great. Thank you. And there was a young woman. Yeah, last question.
So my question is about Mizrahi Jews specifically. I noticed that there's a lot of emphasis and focus on talking about European Jews. And of course, the question and the denialism of Palestinians, but I feel like in the US in general, whenever I talk to someone and I bring up Mizrahi Jews in the questions, they tend to not know exactly how they ended up in Israel. And I talk about the situation in which Israel sent out emissaries to Arab countries in order to create tension situations to convince Mizrahi Jews to leave and go to Israel to legitimize Israel as a home for the Jewish people. A lot of people tell me in person this is a conspiracy theory, although there is hard evidence proving that it actually happened, including the terrorist attacks that happened in Iraq and the terrorist attacks happened in Egypt. And it is extensively talked about by Professor Joseph Masad in Columbia, and also Ilan Pape and Avishay in Oxford. So can you talk a little bit more about where that narrative fits in the history of presence across the US, and why is it not really clear or talked about enough in maybe actually?
Yeah, thank
So
you.
the first question, you have to remind everyone, was really how do you distinguish between real, actual anti-Semitism versus the weaponization of anti-Semitism to defend Israeli policy? How do we, morally sort of deal with that tension?
Well, I mean, the first question was also about the epistemic mutations, colonialism, whether it's French colonialism in North Africa or it's Israeli colonialism in Palestine, or British colonialism in Palestine, or French colonialism in Syria. How it sort of these colonial forces took what was an evident social reality of religious difference, and they sort of weaponized that basically to serve their ends. So that's I mean, again, historians have studied this and covered this, and depending on which location we're talking about, there's a specific history. I think the easiest antidote to that, to those who say don't just blame the West, is to say, of course, we should study the history of coexistence critically, not romanticize coexistence, but at the same time, understand that there's an extraordinary tradition that is centuries old that needs to be historicized and periodized and studied in its own sort of terms. And so depending on, again, what we're looking at, that's the way. So, and you can't just look at a European history and like Bernard Lewis, who talks about the Jews of Islam, where he says there's a Judeo-Muslim tradition that is then sort of eventually breaks down when Muslims and Arabs import European anti-Semitism. And the entire barometer is for Lewis is how one community is treated. And that's the basis upon which you judge an entire history, as opposed to saying, how did this history work out where there wasn't a Jewish question in the Middle East at all? And that's significant. That tells us its own history about how Jews were part and parcel. They were as diverse as other communities. Do you see what I'm saying? There's an extraordinarily complex history that needs to be appreciated, studied, historicized. And of course, the antidote to the question of anti-Semitism is to make the distinction. There is, of course, real anti-Semitism. There absolutely is real anti-Semitism. And the main sort of argument is to distinguish anti-Zionism from anti-Semitism. It's pretty obvious. That's why there are so many Jewish students who are anti-Zionist, who are part and parcel of a coalition of students of all faiths who are clearly opposed to unethical, immoral policies and practices and mindsets. It's so evident. It's clearly not a question. Do you see what I'm saying? So that's very obvious. That it's being weaponized is not surprised. I mean, that's been a tactic of the Israeli state from day one, to refuse this separation, to say that in fact, to be Zionist is to be Jewish, and to be Jewish is to be Zionist. That is part and parcel of the Israeli sort of state ideology. That's the Zionist ideology. But that's, again, one should never deny anti-Semitism, but you can't frame the entire debate about the student thing about anti-Semitism, because then what you're doing is that you're diminishing what the students are actually saying, which is about liberation and freedom and an end to genocide, and you're bringing it to a different debate. So that's my point. Of course, the strongest antidote to anti-Semitism is opposing anti-Semitism, opposing real anti-Semitism, and pointing out the Christian Zionists and all the others, like Western Zionists, many of whom are actually anti-Semites, and pointing that out to people. But again, that's an issue that's crystal clear to anyone who actually knows the history and follows what these people actually say. And to separate, again, the question and to bring it down to its basic, most obvious core, which is, do you want freedom and equality for people, irrespective of what faith they belong to and what faith tradition they belong to? Yes or no? It's as simple as that. And do you believe in that genuinely? Or are you going to say, I want to privilege an ethno-religious state? That's the real question. Jewish
demographics.
I'm not a specialist on that. I'm sure there are people who could answer that question, but I don't really work on that, so I can't answer that question.
Okay. The last question was about the Mizrahi Jews, but could you explain the term, because I don't think everyone is familiar with it?
Well, Mizrahi Jews is an Israeli term for Eastern Jews, Jews of the Eastern world, and it's a term that encompasses all sorts of Jews who are not Ashkenazi Jews. And the idea, of course, is that yes, the question is actually an excellent question. There's a whole history. I mean, but there is an extraordinary now amount of literature and history that's being written on Mizrahi Jews or on Eastern Jews, whether it's Sephardic Jews, Arab Jews. You mentioned Avi Shleim, so I would encourage everybody to go back and explore this history and read these histories and read Avi Shleim, for example, and read his own memoir. I think it's called Three Worlds, if I'm not mistaken. Right. Read his memoir and just again, without using the terrible what happened to the Arab Jewish communities, including in Iraq, and their dispersion and the destruction of that community and the dispersal after 1948, not using that as a pretext, which is what the Zionists often do. They say, well, look, Jews were expelled from country X, Y, and Z, as a way, as if that has in any way, as if in any way that justifies what happened to the Palestinians, and as if these are not related. These are two sides of the same coin. It's the same catastrophic problem of nationalism, but a nationalism that was clearly provoked in the case of Palestine by an ethno-religious nationalist project backed by colonialism in the 20th century. That's where we are.
Ussama, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking